transfer out of the church. So these are constantly going on all the time. It's like when you drive a car. You know, the wheels are turning all the time when you're driving a car. And the same in the church. These are happening all the time in the church. But what's going on is that in the first part of the life cycle of the church, over on the left side, you have a dominance of that positive feedback loop. Otherwise, you have so many people coming to faith, so many people being raised in the church, so many people transferring into the church that the church tends to grow. In the middle years, you have kind of a balance that the people who leave balances out with the people who come, and the church stays on a plateau. But then in the later years of the life cycle of the church, you don't have enough people coming in anymore to balance things out. And so the death rate and the people who transfer out and the people who drift away from the Lord tends to overpower the church, and the church begins to decline. So what is it that we really want to do? What we want to do is we want to bring the church back to what I call a growth point. Now the growth point, notice, the growth point is right before you get up on this plateau. The growth point is where you have the maximum number of conversions to Christ, the maximum number of transfers into the church, and the maximum number of children who are being born and raised up in the faith. Once you get on the plateau, you've actually begun to decline. There's really no such thing as just staying even. Once you're on the plateau, you're already declining. Because you've lost your vision, you've lost your energy. And you may not know it yet. It's like that cruise ship. You're sitting on the deck, and the cruise ship is still moving. You don't know that the engine's been turned off, but the cruise ship is still moving. So when you get up here on the top of the plateau, somewhere up here, you're already really in decline. You just don't know it yet. So what we want to do is we want to bring our church back to this particular place right there. We want to try and get our church to a point where we've got the maximum involvement of new people coming to faith, new people transferring into the church, and the maximum number of children being born and raised up in the faith in the church. Now, how this happens is that we have to, before we peak out at the plateau, we have to begin to inject into our church new, fresh vision for the future of the church. And that's usually signified this way. See, here's the first, over here on the left side, I'm going to use the little red pointer. So here's the first growth cycle. And then the church is beginning to decline here. But before it declines, we need to begin to put a new vision in place that will help the church go on a new growth curve. You see, there's a difference between the human life cycle and the church life cycle. I cannot go back and be 20 years old again. Sometimes I think I'd like to. Other times I think I would be crazy to. I don't know. But you know, when we're getting older, you can't go back and be 20 years old again. You can't go back and be 30 years old again when you pass those ages. But here's the point. A church can. A church that's 60 years old can go back and be 15 years old again. A church that's 40 years old can go back and be 20 years old again. And the way a church does that is by redeveloping a new vision for the future of the church. It's where the pastor and the board, the elders, the deacons, whatever your leadership group is called, your team of people, they get together and they pray and they assess the church and they assess the community and they develop that new vision of what God wants us to do for the future. And they begin to put that vision into play and into place. And as they put that new vision into place, usually meaning that they got to make changes in the church, then the church begins to develop new energy and begins to develop a new life cycle for the future. There are some older churches that have been around 100, 200 years that are very healthy. And if you were to begin to look at them you would discover that they've actually gone through several life cycles. They've been healthy and they began to decline, and then they became healthy again. And then they declined and they became healthy again. And so what we want to do is we want to intentionally begin to think, what is the new thing that God wants us to do? What is the new vision that God wants for us in the future? I like to put it this way. Every one of our churches celebrates a communion service where we remember the death, burial, and resurrection. Some churches I go to, they'll typically have a communion table. And many times on the front of the table, they'll have something that is written on the front. And in most churches, what they have written on the front of their communion table are these words: "Do this in remembrance of me." Now, think about those words for a minute. Do this in remembrance of me. Remembrance causes us to look to the past and to remember that Jesus Christ came, lived the holy life. He died on the cross. He was buried. He gave his body. He gave his blood for us. And we're remembering that death and that burial and that resurrection. It's causing us to look to the past. Now, in other churches I've been to, on the front of their communion table, they have a different phrase written there. And many churches I've been in today, the phrase says, "Until he comes." Until he comes. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 says we need to do this in remembrance of him until he comes. Well, the phrase "until he comes" points us in a different direction. It points us to the future, in anticipation of the fact that Jesus Christ is going to come back and he's going to take us home to be with himself. And so it points us to the future hope of the return of Christ. Now, I would suggest to you that both are true, and that the communion service is a living tradition of the church. And the reason it's a living tradition is because it points us to the past, but it also points us to the future. So we look to the past to remember Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, what he did for us. But we also recognize that that same Jesus, that same God is alive today and doing great things for us today, and he wants to do great things for us in the future. And so the communion service is a living tradition because it gives us meaning to the past, to the present, as we take communion together with the body, and we look in with anticipation to the future. So what we have to do in the church, when you've got an older church, is that you've got to develop a vision that gives praise to the past of what the church has done, but also to recognize that the same God who blessed the church for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years in the past is still alive. And he wants to do good things for us today. Yes, he wants to do good things for us into the future. And the way we do that is by developing a new vision, by praising what God has done in the past, by being thankful for what the people in our church have done faithfully in the past, yes. But don't live in the past, see? We can't live back there. What we have to do is recognize that the best way we honor the past is to make sure that our church is still here being a vibrant and healthy church in the future. And we do that by developing this vision. So what happens is we right in here, we've got to develop a new vision that takes us in a new direction. And I call this area a choice point. It's a choice point because we as a church have to make a choice. Are we going to act in faith and move towards the future, or are we going to go back and try and live in the past? What happened with the nation of Israel? Moses brings them out of Egypt, right? And he takes them up to the edge of the Jordan River. And God wants them to go in and take possession of the land. And so Moses and they choose one person from each of the 12 tribes, and they send them in as spies. Remember the story? And they go in and they look around and they come back. And Moses and the rest of the leaders said, well, what did you find? And two of them What were their names? Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb said, let's go in. We can do it. We can defeat these giants. We can take the land. And the other 10 people said, no, we're too scared. We're not going to go in. By the way, what were their names? Anybody know? We don't know their names, do we? None of us knows the names of those people. They're in the Bible. But, who cares, right? Joshua and Caleb, now there's some people with faith. But, that was a choice point. See, Israel was given an opportunity to have a vision, to move into the land and take it over and move forward. They had a choice. And at that point in time, they chose not to go in. And it was 40 years before they were able to have another chance to go in. They had a choice point, and they didn't go in. And that whole generation, 20 years old and older, died in the wilderness. And none of them were allowed to go in and see the land except for Joshua and Caleb. Not even Moses or Aaron were allowed to go in and see the land. And you see, what happens in our churches is that God sometimes brings us up on the edge of opportunity, and we have a choice. And we have to make a decision. Do we take advantage of this or are we not? And we're going to talk later in the afternoon session what some of those choices are. But for instance, maybe your church has an opportunity to move to a larger facility. But your people say, no, that's going to cost a little bit more money. We're not going to move over there. Folks, that's a choice point. You just chose to be a small church. Why did you choose to be a small church? Because you didn't have the faith to move to a larger facility where you could add another 100 people. And where you're at, you're not big enough to add another 100 people. Or maybe someone suggests to you, well, let's stay where we are, but let's have 2 services. And somebody in your church says, no, we don't want to go to 2 services because then we'd be 2 churches and we'd split the family of God. You've heard that before, huh? And so you don't go to 2 services. And what happens is you don't grow. Why? Because you had a choice to go to 2 services. You chose not to go to 2 services, just like the nation of Israel chose not to go in the promised land. And you made your own choice. Let me tell you something. Your church is the size it is because your church has chosen to be the size it is. You just don't know that. Because your church has had opportunities probably, and your leaders, your congregation, somebody with influence in the church chose not to take advantage of the opportunity. And God said, okay, it's your choice. You didn't have the faith to take the steps to grow, so therefore you stay the size you are. Now, sometimes God, 10 years later, 15 years later, will give your church another opportunity. When I was in my church, I told you, in this little church, we went from 50 to 73 to 85. We got up around 125, and we just stopped growing. And we all knew what the problem was. We were in one worship service, and our auditorium seated 88 people. And we would bring in chairs. And so that helped us get up to 125. But there was just no chance to grow anymore. We couldn't get any more people in the auditorium. Well, they didn't want to go to the 2 services. So we had some vacant land next to the church, about half an acre. And so we decided as elders to suggest to the church that let's build a larger auditorium on that property. And so we went through, a lot of planning and thinking and praying. We finally took it to the church. We were a Baptist church, which meant that the whole congregation had the vote. So we took it to the congregation, and we presented it to the congregation. And we could hear the rumblings in the congregation. Costs too much money. We can't do it. And we knew that it was going down to defeat. And there was a young man in the church. He was actually the son of the main family in the church. Do you have that issue here in Manila where you have a main family that kind of controls things. Okay. That happens everywhere, I think. But we had this one family in the church, and it was the mother and the father, the matriarch and the patriarch, and their 2 sons and 2 daughters, and they were all married, and I mean the big decision-making group right there. And we knew that this proposal was going down to defeat. And this young man, a member of the family, stood up. He was about 22, 23 years old. And he addressed the congregation. And this is what he said. I don't know the exact wording, but this is what he said. He said, I've just been sitting back here. And I remember, I think it was about 10 years ago when I was 12 years old, we had a meeting just like this with Pastor so-and-so. And he named the pastor before me. And he says, and I remember that Pastor so-and-so wanted to build a new facility out there on that property. And I remember sitting here at 12 years old watching the congregation vote no. And he says, it's been 10 years before God gave us an opportunity to do it again under Pastor McIntosh. He says, I'm afraid if we vote no again, God might not ever give us another chance. And he sat down. Now, if I would have said that, it would have had no authority because I wasn't part of the family. God bless that young man. We took a vote and it passed. 97%. There were still 3% that voted no, but that's it. So we built that building, and we were able to build an auditorium that seated about 250 people, and that's why the church was able to grow to 250, because we built that. Now, see, the church had a choice point. And one time they rejected it, and the next time they said yes. Now, if they would have rejected it again, there's no way that we could have kept growing. I'm just suggesting that if you look in the history of your church, you may see that there were opportunities that God gave you. And maybe your church, for one reason or another, said no. They didn't have the faith to go forward. But if they have the faith to go forward, then what happens is we move through that life cycle. Now, what we want to do this afternoon, after we take our afternoon break, is I want to come back and I want to talk about, right in here, what are the predictable changes and choice points that need to be made in most churches at each size of church. Okay? So God bless you. Or do we need any instructions? Mike, come on up and tell us what we need to do.